picture this. It's late November 1941. You're out in the freezing, unforgiving waters of the North Pacific. Smashing through these massive, heavy winter swells is a Phantom Armada. 33 warships, including 6 heavy aircraft carriers, the infamous WWII. And the craziest part? Absolute strict radio silence. Not a single signal, no outward trace that they even exist. Right now, this isn't just some routine military maneuver. This is a living world teetering on the absolute brink. It's a high-stakes gamble hurtling toward a moment that's going to violently reshape the entire 20th century. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're not just looking at what happened at Pearl Harbor. We're going deep. We're going to uncover the hidden forces, the key individuals, and the profound miscalculations that made this geopolitical earthquake possible.
Okay, let's dive into this. At exactly 7:53 a.m. on December 7th, Captain Mitsuo Fuchida is peering down from his bomber. Below him, unsuspecting American ships just sitting there, moored in neat little pairs right along Battleship Row. He breaks that long, agonizing radio silence and shouts a coded phrase. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. It meant one thing. Total surprise had been achieved. In this single, flawlessly executed tactical strike, the Japanese completely neutralized the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But, as we'll see, this tactical masterpiece would inadvertently and violently awaken a dormant superpower.
Part 1. The Pacific Powder Keg. To really understand how we got to that chilling Sunday morning, we have to realize something absolutely crucial. History is never inevitable. For a whole decade, Japan had been aggressively expanding its empire, right? They invaded Manchuria in 31, launched a brutal, full-scale war in China by 37. But here's the catch. Their war machine was dangerously overstretched. The real tipping point, that arrived in August 1941. The United States slammed Japan with a devastating oil embargo, and we're talking about cutting off 80% of Japan's oil supply, gone. Without American petroleum, the Japanese empire would literally grind to a halt. So they were backed into a desperate corner: retreat and lose face, or strike south to seize the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic psychological disconnect between the two nations. On November 26th, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull hands over a 10-point proposal to Japanese envoys. Basically, demanded they withdraw from China and Indochina. Now, to the Americans, this was just a diplomatic stance, right? A hardline negotiation to maintain peace. But over in Tokyo, to the militant Japanese government led by Hideki Tojo, this was perceived as an absolute, unacceptable war ultimatum. It is a textbook case of asymmetric perception. While the diplomats in Washington were still talking, the gears of a massive military machine had already started turning. Part 2. The Master Plan. Think about the sheer logistics of this for a second. How on earth do you cripple a superpower's naval fleet across the largest ocean on the planet? Well, you need an unprecedented architectural feat of naval warfare. Enter Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Now, Japan's geographic imperative was actually crystal clear. Their real prize was the oil and rubber down in Southeast Asia. But sitting right on their eastern flank, pointing at them like a dagger, was the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto knew full well that a prolonged war against America's massive industrial base was totally unwinnable. Their only shot: completely immobilize the U.S. fleet in one massive knockout blow. That would buy Japan about 6 months to secure their southern conquests and hopefully force a stalemate. The audacity of this operation is just staggering. Working alongside Commander Minoru Genda, Yamamoto drew inspiration from some wild places: a 1925 fictional book by Hector Bywater and the British Royal Air Force's daring 1940 attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto. The strike force they assembled utilized 6 heavy carriers. At the time, that was a totally unprecedented concentration of naval aviation. And to make sure the Americans didn't spot them, they deliberately chose a punishing 3,500-mile route straight across the stormy northern Pacific. They literally plunged through massive winter swells in absolute total secrecy. Part 3. A Day of Infamy. But, no plan survives contact with reality. As the sun rose that morning, all that grand strategy slammed into the chaotic friction of war. And the real tragedy here, the U.S. wasn't entirely blind. The system just utterly failed to connect the dots. First, a critical Japanese message asking about ship berthing positions was actually intercepted, but it was set aside to be decoded on Monday. Then, at 6:40 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward literally sank a Japanese midget submarine right outside the harbor. But that report crawled up the chain of command way too slowly. And maybe the most agonizing miss of all, a brand new radar station at Opena Point spotted a massive blip of incoming planes. The officer in charge, he dismissed it, assuming it was just a scheduled flight of friendly American B-17s. All these tragic, missed signals are exactly what allowed those 353 Japanese aircraft to strike completely out of the blue. The cost of that total surprise was absolutely catastrophic. In just 1 hour and 15 minutes, the living, breathing world of Pearl Harbor was turned into a burning graveyard. 2,403 Americans were killed. Another 1,178 were wounded. 19 U.S. Navy ships, including 8 massive battleships, were left destroyed or severely damaged in the fiery wreckage. So the crucial point is this. Beyond the horrific physical wreckage, there was a massive diplomatic failure that totally changed how the entire war was framed. See, Japan had actually planned to deliver a 14-part diplomatic message severing ties just minutes before the attack began. They wanted to technically comply with the Hague Convention, but the message took way too long to decode and type up in Washington. By the time it was finally delivered, the bombs were literally already falling in Hawaii. That delay turned what was supposed to be a formal military strike into a perceived sneak attack. It was seen as an act of ultimate treacherous deception, and it ignited an absolute firestorm of American outrage. Part 4. The Third Wave Debate. Now, amidst all this wreckage, a really fascinating historical debate emerged. It's this tantalizing what-if that historians are still arguing about today. For decades, there was this hugely popular narrative, actually heavily promoted years later by Captain Fuchida himself, that a massive third wave of attacks was completely pre-planned, but then timidly canceled at the very last minute by the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. But we have to ask, is that the actual truth, or is it just a post-war myth? Well, while there was no official pre-written order for it, the idea was definitely being hotly debated on the Japanese flight decks that morning. Commander Genda and Fuchida were pushing incredibly hard for a third strike. And their targets this time? Not ships. They wanted to take out the base's life support. If Japan could destroy the massive fuel tanks, the dry docks, and the repair yards, the strategic value would have been immense. The U.S. Pacific Fleet simply couldn't have operated out of Hawaii for months. They would have been forced to retreat 2,000 miles, all the way back to San Diego, which would have drastically altered the entire timeline of the Pacific War. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the cold, hard reality of military calculus completely dismantles that myth of a cowardly retreat. Admiral Nagumo wasn't acting out of fear. He was strictly following Imperial Navy doctrine. Think about his situation. First off, the American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and Lexington, were miraculously not at Pearl Harbor that morning. Their locations were completely unknown. That's a huge threat. Second, launching a third wave meant his pilots would have to return and land in the dark. And in 1941, nobody had safe night carrier landing procedures. Add in the fact that American anti-aircraft fire was rapidly getting organized, and Nagumo knew the truth. Risking his absolutely irreplaceable carriers just to hit infrastructure was a wild gamble. It could have jeopardized Japan's entire strategy for the Pacific. Part 5. Global Ripple Effects. So, Nagumo sails away, leaving that vital infrastructure intact. Japan had secured a spectacular tactical victory, but as we'll see, it set off a chain reaction that proved to be a fatal strategic miscalculation. The very next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stands before a joint session of Congress. And rather than giving some dense, boring recitation of Japanese treaty violations, he delivers an incredibly brief, masterful appeal to the American people. He famously declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. FDR brilliantly utilized the rhetorical concept of kairos, saying the exact right words at the exact right moment. In just one short speech, he instantly vaporized the massive American isolationist movement and unified a deeply divided public into a single righteous force.
And then, the conflict went truly global. On December 11th, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini made what is arguably one of the most disastrous miscalculations in all of military history. Citing the Tripartite Pact, they formally declared war on the United States. Just like that, in a matter of days, this regional war over in Europe and the regional war in the Pacific were violently merged into a single, all-encompassing World War II. Tokyo had sincerely hoped this attack would shatter American resolve. Instead, they galvanized it beyond belief. The United States rapidly shifted onto a total war footing, transforming into exactly what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. And this wasn't just a military draft. We were talking about a complete societal overhaul. Auto factories instantly stopped making cars,
and started churning out tanks and bombers. Everyday civilians accepted strict federal rationing of rubber, steel, and gas. They planted over 20 million victory gardens in their backyards. The American economy transformed overnight into this unstoppable, mechanized juggernaut. It was an economic engine that Japan, with its highly finite resources, could never, ever hope to match. Which brings us to the ultimate, haunting paradox of December 7th, 1941. I want to leave you with this question to ponder. How does a flawless tactical strike, executed with such unprecedented brilliance and daring, ultimately forge the very superpower that guarantees that empire's absolute destruction? Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack. It was the crucible that forged the modern world.